At 2:17 a.m., my mother left me a voicemail saying I was cut out of the family trust. She thought she could scare me into submission again. What she didn't know, I had receipts. When her forged documents and secret trust withdrawals started surfacing, her perfect image began to crumble. By Thanksgiving, she wasn't the powerful matriarch anymore. She was a woman under investigation begging me to fix this. I didn't. I woke up at exactly 2:17 a.m. to the hollow vibration of my phone rattling against the nightstand, the sound sharp and unnatural in the kind of silence that only exists in the middle of the night. For a few seconds, I just stared at the ceiling, disoriented, my heart thudding harder than the situation probably deserved. I remember thinking that nothing good ever happens at 2:17 in the morning, and I reached for the phone, already bracing myself. The screen showed one missed call and a voicemail from my mother, timestamped 2:14 a.m. She has always preferred leaving messages over saying things directly when she knows they will hurt more that way. I pressed play while still lying in the dark, the blue glow of the screen cutting across the room. Her voice came through steady and controlled, not raised, not emotional, just cold. She said, "Don't bother coming for Christmas. I've instructed my attorney to remove you from the family trust. Don't test me." Then there was a click. No goodbye. No explanation. Just that. The tone was what struck me most. It was the same tone she used when I was 12, and she would tell me I had disappointed her. The same tight restraint that always meant she had already decided the verdict, and there would be no appeal. I did not feel shock. That is the part that still sits heavy with me. A normal person might feel blindsided getting a message like that in the middle of the night. I felt tired, bone tired, because this was not an explosion. It was escalation. It was the next calculated step in a pattern that has been playing out for more than 2 decades. My mother has never needed a scream to control a room. She learned early that silence and withdrawal are far more effective tools. Money became another one after my father died. When my dad passed away, I was 12 years old. One minute he was there, loud and warm and filling up the house with his laugh, and the next minute it was just my mother standing in the kitchen in a black dress, looking smaller but somehow sharper. People always talk about how grief softens people, how it makes them fragile. In my mother's case, it made her precise. She tightened everything. The house ran on schedules. Emotions were something you managed privately. I remember standing in the doorway of her bedroom a few weeks after the funeral, trying to tell her I missed him, and she looked at me with eyes that were already distant and told me I needed to be strong for my little sister. Chloe was 8 at the time. She cried loudly and often, and my mother would pull her into her arms and whisper that everything would be okay. I stood there, older by 4 years, but feeling decades older, and absorbed the unspoken message that my job was to handle it. From that point on, I became the responsible one. I helped Chloe with homework. I made sure she ate. I learned how to fix things around the house, because my mother said she could not deal with calling repairmen. When bills came in, she would sigh dramatically and leave them on the counter long enough for me to see them, even though I was barely a teenager and could do nothing about them. As I got older, the dynamic hardened. Chloe was protected. Chloe was sensitive. Chloe needed extra understanding. I was dependable. I was capable. I could take it. If Chloe forgot to do something, my mother would say she was overwhelmed. If I slipped up, even slightly, I was told I was ungrateful. When I got my first part-time job at 16, my mother praised me publicly for being such a good son, then privately reminded me that family always comes first and that any money I earned should contribute to the household. I handed over more than I kept, telling myself that was what good sons did. The family trust became a kind of mythic presence in our lives after my father's insurance payout and investments were reorganized. My mother mentioned it casually at first, usually in the context of security. She would say things like, "You will both be taken care of as long as you respect the family." Over time, the language shifted. It became less about protection and more about obedience. When I chose a college major she did not like, she reminded me that tuition assistance came from the trust. When I dated someone she disapproved of, she hinted that certain benefits could be reconsidered. It was never a direct threat in the beginning. It was always framed as concern, as guidance. By the time I was in my late 20s, the pattern was obvious. Chloe still lived close to her, still leaned on her for advice about everything from relationships to groceries. I had moved an hour away for work, carving out a life that felt increasingly separate from the gravitational pull of our house. Each time I set a boundary, however small, there was a consequence. Holidays would become tense. Phone calls would grow shorter and colder. The trust would resurface in conversation like a quiet reminder of who held the leverage. So when I listened to that voicemail at 2:17 a.m., I did not hear a spontaneous outburst. I heard strategy. Christmas was just the stage. The real message was that she was willing to use the final card she believed she had. Removing me from the trust was not about money alone. It was about reminding me that loyalty, in her definition, is transactional. It was about testing whether I would come crawling back, apologizing for whatever unnamed offense she had decided justified this move. I lay there in the dark for a long time after the message ended, replaying it once more just to be certain I had not misheard. The house around me was still. My life, separate from hers, felt quiet and stable in that moment. I thought about the boy I had been at 12, trying to swallow grief so my mother would not have to. I thought about the years of absorbing tension so Chloe would not feel it. I realized that every time she tightened her grip, I had responded by trying harder, by proving myself again. This time something in me felt different. Not angry, not panicked, just finished. I did not call her back. I did not draft a message. I did not defend myself against an accusation she had not even bothered to articulate. I placed the phone face down on a nightstand and stared at the ceiling until the adrenaline faded. The silence that followed was not heavy with dread. It was unfamiliar, almost clean. For the first time in years, I let a threat sit unanswered. I let her words exist without scrambling to fix them. And in that stillness, I understood that the voicemail was not about Christmas, and it was not even about the trust. It was about control, and for once, I was not reaching for the leash. After my father died, my mother became obsessed with presentation, with making sure that anyone looking in from the outside saw resilience instead of fracture, strength instead of imbalance. And she rebuilt our lives in Brookhaven, Illinois, with the precision of someone staging a model home, where the curtains were always open just enough and the lawn was trimmed to the same exact height every Sunday afternoon. Neighbors praised her constantly, calling her brave and devoted, and she accepted those compliments with a modest tilt of her head while I stood beside her feeling like a prop in a performance I had never agreed to join. On the surface, we were the picture of a tight-knit suburban family that had survived tragedy through unity and discipline, but inside the walls of our house the roles had already been assigned and they did not shift. Chloe was fragile in my mother's narrative, the sensitive younger daughter who needed extra care because she had lost her father so young, and every mistake she made was filtered through that lens. When she crashed the car at 17 after driving too fast with friends, my mother did not raise her voice or demand accountability. She wrapped Chloe in a blanket on the couch and told anyone who would listen that her baby was overwhelmed, that grief manifests in reckless ways, that teenagers cope differently. The insurance premium increased and the repairs were expensive, but the incident was absorbed into the mythology of Chloe as delicate. I remember standing in the kitchen that night listening to my mother explain that stress could do terrible things to a young girl, and I understood without being told that if it had been me behind that wheel, the word irresponsible would have been used instead of overwhelmed. By the time I was in college, I was working 2 jobs while carrying a full course load, waking up before sunrise to open at a campus coffee shop, and closing at a tech store 3 nights a week. And whenever relatives commented on how hard I was pushing myself, my mother would smile and say that is what good sons do, as if exhaustion were a moral obligation rather than a circumstance. There was no concern about whether I was overwhelmed, no suggestion that maybe I deserved to focus solely on my studies, only an expectation that I would manage because I always had. I sent money home whenever I could, small transfers at first, and then larger ones as I picked up more hours, and the gratitude was brief and quickly replaced with commentary about how families support each other without keeping score. Every achievement I earned somehow became absorbed into her story. When I graduated with a degree in cybersecurity and landed a job in Austin at 25, The first solid position that felt like a real step forward, she announced it to friends and extended family, as if it were the culmination of her sacrifice rather than my persistence. She told people she had always pushed me toward technology, that her discipline had shaped my work ethic, that this was proof of her guidance paying off. I stood beside her at a small celebration dinner in Brookhaven, listening to her speak about my offer letter like it was an award she had won, and I felt that familiar sensation of shrinking inside my own success. Even moving to Austin was framed as an extension of her influence, as if I were simply carrying the Whitaker standard into another state on her behalf. Once I started earning a stable salary, the requests became more structured and less apologetic. At first, it was helping Chloe with rent, because she was between jobs and needed a little boost to get back on her feet, and I wired the money without hesitation because I had been trained to equate support with love. Then there was a temporary credit card balance that had gotten out of hand due to unexpected expenses, and I was told it would only be for a few months until things stabilized. Each time I transferred funds, I told myself it was family, that this was what security looked like in action, but the pattern repeated often enough that temporary started to feel permanent. The house renovations were the moment when the lines blurred in a way that made my stomach tighten. My mother wanted to update the kitchen and redo the roof, improvements that would increase the property value of a home that was not in my name and never would be. She explained it as an investment in the family legacy, a way to preserve what my father had built, and she spoke about it with such conviction that refusing felt almost sacrilegious. I contributed a significant portion of my savings, rationalizing that it was better than letting the house deteriorate. Yet there was no paperwork tying my contribution to ownership, no acknowledgement that I was essentially funding an asset that benefited everyone but me. Over time, I began to notice that my role had solidified into something transactional. Chloe's needs were framed as urgent and emotional, while mine were assumed to be manageable because I was stable, and stability in our family translated to availability. When I hesitated or asked for clarity about repayment timelines, my mother's tone shifted subtly, the warmth draining out and replaced by something cool and corrective. She would remind me of everything she had done for us after my father died, of the sleepless nights and financial planning and sacrifices, as if those realities nullified any right I had to question the current flow of money. Setting boundaries did not happen in one dramatic declaration. It happened slowly as I began to feel the weight of my own life in Austin, the rent I paid, the retirement account I wanted to grow, the sense that I deserved to build something that was not constantly redirected back to Brookhaven. The first time I said I could not send extra money because I was focusing on my own savings, there was a long silence on the phone before my mother responded that she was disappointed in how distant I had become. When I declined to cover another round of credit card debt, she framed it as me turning my back on my sister during a vulnerable time. The language of support transformed into the language of betrayal almost overnight. I could feel the narrative adjusting around me, casting me not as the dependable son, but as the ungrateful one who had forgotten where he came from. The same discipline and independence she once praised were now recast as selfishness. It became clear that as long as my success flowed back toward her, it was a testament to family unity, but the moment I tried to redirect that energy toward my own future, it was seen as abandonment. In her version of events, boundaries were not healthy limits, they were acts of defiance. And each time I held one, however small, I could sense the tension building, as if I were quietly dismantling a structure she had spent years constructing. One where Chloe remained protected, she remained central, and I remained the resource that kept everything balanced. Last Thanksgiving was the first time I brought Rachel Moore home to Brookhaven, and I remember the entire drive from Austin feeling like I was transporting something fragile across state lines. Not because Rachel was weak, but because I knew exactly how environments can shift under my mother's influence. Rachel is kind in a way that does not draw attention to itself, steady and thoughtful, the type of person who listens fully before she speaks, and she had been nervous for days leading up to that trip, even though she tried to hide it behind jokes about surviving her first Whitaker holiday. I assured her it would be fine, that my family could be intense but harmless, and even as I said it, I felt the quiet dishonesty of the statement settling in my chest. When we pulled up to the house in Brookhaven, everything looked as staged as it always did. The yard immaculate, the porch decorated in symmetrical autumn arrangements, warm light glowing through the windows in a way that suggested comfort rather than calculation. My mother greeted us at the door with a hug that lingered just a second too long, her smile polished and camera-ready, and she held Rachel at arm's length to look her over in a way that felt like assessment rather than welcome. She complimented her dress, her posture, her smile, each word coated in sweetness that felt just slightly over-applied, like perfume used to mask something sour underneath. Inside, extended family members were already gathered around the dining room, plates half full, wine glasses reflecting the chandelier light. Conversations quieted briefly when we entered, and I felt that familiar childhood sensation of being evaluated without anyone saying it out loud. Rachel stayed close to me, polite and composed, answering questions about her job and her family with careful detail, making eye contact, laughing at the appropriate moments. I could see how hard she was trying to make a good impression, and I hated that she felt she needed to. Dinner moved forward in predictable waves, my mother orchestrating the flow of dishes and conversation with subtle cues, redirecting topics when they drifted somewhere she did not approve of, highlighting Chloe's recent projects with glowing commentary. Chloe sat to my mother's right, animated and relaxed, recounting stories that were met with indulgent laughter. When the focus shifted to me, it was framed around work and distance, subtle reminders that I live far away now, that Austin was a long way from home, that some people prioritize career over proximity. I answered evenly, refusing to rise to the bait, keeping my tone neutral. Rachel was seated beside me, close enough that our arms touched, and I could feel her tension building as the evening wore on. Not because anything overtly hostile had happened, but because of the undercurrent, the sense that every comment had layers. Then, as dessert plates were being passed around and the room had settled into that heavy, satisfied lull, my mother set down her fork, dabbed at the corner of her mouth with a napkin, and turned her attention to me with a smile that was almost theatrical in its gentleness. She said my name softly, drawing just enough attention from a table, and then in that same honeyed tone asked when I was going to date someone more permanent. She stretched the word permanent just slightly, letting it hang in the air as if it were an innocent curiosity rather than a calculated incision. Rachel was sitting right there, her hand resting near mine, her expression open and unsuspecting up until the moment the implication landed. Conversations around the table faltered into awkward silence, forks pausing midair, relatives suddenly very interested in their plates. The message was unmistakable. It was not a question about my future. It was a dismissal of the woman beside me, a public minimization designed to reassert hierarchy. In my mother's framework, relationships that did not pass through her approval were temporary by default, and by labeling Rachel as something less than permanent, she was reminding everyone in the room that she still believed she had the authority to define the legitimacy of my life. It was a dominance move delivered with a smile, the kind that allows plausible deniability if challenged. I felt the old reflex ignite inside me, the instinct to deflect with humor, to smooth things over so the evening could continue without visible cracks. That had always been my role, absorbing the discomfort so others would not have to confront it. I glanced at Rachel and saw the flicker of hurt she tried to mask with a polite smile, and something in me shifted from endurance to clarity. I realized that if I let that comment pass unaddressed, I would be complicit in the humiliation, reinforcing the very dynamic that had followed me since I was 12. So I set my fork down carefully, not abruptly, not angrily, and I met my mother's gaze directly. My voice, when I spoke, was calm in a way that surprised even me. I said that was enough. I did not raise my tone, I did not elaborate, I did not justify. Two simple words, delivered steadily, cutting through the room's tension like a line drawn in ink. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument could have. My mother's smile froze for a fraction of a second, her eyes sharpening as she recalibrated in real time. Around us, relatives shifted uncomfortably, someone clearing their throat, another reaching for a glass of water, as if hydration could dissolve the moment. Rachel remained still beside me, her posture straightening slightly as if she understood that something fundamental had just occurred. My mother recovered quickly, offering a light laugh and suggesting that I was being overly sensitive, that she was only joking, that everyone needed to relax. The conversation resumed in stilted fragments, but the atmosphere had changed. The performance had cracked. For the rest of the evening, my mother's interactions with me were clipped and efficient, the warmth drained and replaced by cool politeness. She directed most of her attention toward Chloe and other relatives, subtly excluding me from side conversations, reinforcing through omission what she could no longer assert openly. I recognized the pattern immediately. When control is challenged publicly, retaliation shifts into quieter channels. Driving back to our hotel that night, Rachel reached for my hand and told me she was proud of me, and I felt both relief and the distant tremor of consequence. I knew my mother well enough to understand that she would not forget those two words. In her worldview, correction flows downward, never upward, and by calmly telling her to stop in front of witnesses, I had disrupted the order she relied on. That Thanksgiving did not end with shouting or dramatic exits, but marked the moment the conflict moved from unspoken tension to open defiance. From that day forward, every interaction carried the weight of that boundary, and I could feel the beginning of something more deliberate forming beneath her composure. When my great-aunt Margaret Ellis passed away, the call came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon while I was at my desk in Austin reviewing a security audit, and the news felt unreal in the way sudden losses often do, like the air had shifted pressure without warning. She was my father's older sister, a woman who had always existed slightly outside the gravitational pull of my mother's carefully curated world, independent and observant, with a dry sense of humor that never needed an audience. She never flaunted wealth, never spoke about investments or long-term planning. Yet over decades, she had quietly built something substantial through property purchases and disciplined stock investments, decisions made without spectacle or commentary. I flew back for the funeral with a heavy but uncomplicated grief, remembering childhood visits where she would sit with me on the back porch and ask about school in a way that suggested she genuinely wanted to know rather than evaluate. She had a way of listening that felt rare in my family, a patience that did not rush to reinterpret my answers into something more convenient. At the service, my mother carried herself with composed sorrow, greeting relatives with steady hands and measured sighs, presenting the image of a family matriarch absorbing yet another loss with dignified endurance. The shock came days later when the attorney requested a meeting to discuss the will. I assumed there would be a modest distribution among extended relatives, perhaps a small charitable donation, nothing extraordinary. Instead, I sat in a quiet office and listened as the lawyer explained that Margaret had named me as the sole beneficiary of her estate, with no split, no conditions, no clauses requiring oversight or shared management. The properties, the investment accounts, the accumulated dividends, everything had been assigned to me. The words felt detached from reality at first, as if they were describing someone else's life. The room was silent after the explanation, and I remember feeling a mixture of disbelief and an unexpected weight settling on my shoulders. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was a decisive one. Margaret had made her intentions clear, and she had done so without fanfare, leaving behind paperwork that was precise and unambiguous. There were no side letters suggesting shared control, no instructions that I consult with my mother or include Chloe. It was clean. When the news reached my mother, she did not raise her voice or accuse me directly. She did not storm into the attorney's office or send me furious messages. Instead, she responded with a calmness that felt even more deliberate. In public conversations, she expressed mild surprise and emphasized how close Margaret and I had always been, framing it as a touching reflection of family bonds. Her composure was intact, her smile steady, her tone almost reflective. Behind that surface, however, the air shifted quickly. I began receiving subtle messages from extended relatives, asking careful questions about how often I had visited Margaret in her final months, about whether she had seemed confused or isolated. The phrasing was always gentle, almost hesitant, as if they were reluctant to pry but felt obligated by concern. It did not take long to trace the origin of those doubts. My mother had started making calls, positioning her curiosity as protective rather than accusatory, suggesting that perhaps Margaret had been vulnerable, that perhaps someone had influenced her decisions without realizing the implications. The suggestion that I had manipulated a grieving, elderly woman was never stated outright to me, but it traveled through the family network like a quiet current. I could feel it in the pauses during phone calls, in the careful neutrality of certain relatives who had once been warm. My mother's strategy was not confrontation. It was erosion. She did not need to accuse me publicly if she could seed enough uncertainty privately. Then there was Chloe's letter. I learned about it through the attorney, who informed me that a signed statement had been submitted claiming that Chloe had served as Margaret's primary caregiver in the months leading up to her death. The assertion was demonstrably false. Chloe had visited occasionally, but there had been no sustained caregiving role, no daily assistance, no medical oversight. Yet the document existed, formal and assertive, attempting to create a narrative of dependence that could justify contesting the will. Seeing my sister's name attached to that claim felt less like betrayal and more like confirmation of a script I had watched unfold for years. What unsettled me most was discovering that months before Margaret's death, my mother had contacted Margaret's attorney inquiring about potential updates to the will. She had framed it, I was told, as a routine family matter, expressing concern about whether the estate reflected current relationships and contributions. At the time, Margaret had not made any changes. That detail altered the entire context. This was not spontaneous indignation fueled by grief. This was positioning. My mother had anticipated the possibility of financial movement and had attempted to insert herself into the process before it concluded. Standing back and observing the sequence, the pattern became undeniable. The rumors, the concerned phone calls, the letter asserting caregiving status, the prior contact with legal counsel, each piece fit together too neatly to be accidental. There was no outward explosion because explosions are messy and visible. What unfolded instead was controlled recalibration, an effort to challenge the legitimacy of the inheritance without appearing openly hostile. I did not feel triumphant about the estate. I felt scrutinized. The same dynamic that had defined my childhood resurfaced in a new form. When I worked hard and sent money home, it was expected. When something substantial flowed toward me independently of my mother's influence, it became suspicious. The inheritance disrupted the established hierarchy, placing resources in my hands that were not filtered through her authority. That shift was intolerable not because of the money itself, but because of what it represented. Margaret's decision had been clear and intentional. My mother's response was equally intentional, though executed with subtlety rather than volume. There were no dramatic scenes at the funeral, no public accusations. Instead, there was a quiet campaign to reframe events, to suggest impropriety without stating it outright, to build a case through implication rather than evidence. It was not grief driving those actions. It was strategy, assembled piece by piece long before the will was read. A calculated effort to maintain control in a situation where, for once, the control had bypassed her entirely. After the estate settled and the legal transfers were finalized, I used part of the inheritance to buy a lakeside cabin in Pine Hollow, Michigan, a modest but solid structure tucked between tall pines with a long wooden dock stretching into still water that reflected the sky like polished glass. I did not buy it as an investment or a statement, and I certainly did not buy it to impress anyone back in Brookhaven. I bought it because for the first time in my adult life, I wanted something that existed entirely outside my mother's influence, something that belonged to me without narrative strings attached. The first night, I stayed there alone. I sat on the dock long after sunset, listening to the water move against the posts, and the quiet felt different from the silence of tension I had grown up with. It felt earned. I handled the purchase carefully, structuring it cleanly under my own name, funded directly from the inheritance accounts that had been transferred to me. There were no shared signatories, no co-owners, no trust entanglements. The deed was recorded properly, taxes set up under my information, utilities registered solely to me. It was methodical because I had learned long ago that clarity prevents leverage. The cabin became my retreat between projects, a place where I could step away from Austin's constant motion and recalibrate without anticipating a phone call that would reframe my decisions as obligations. Several months after the purchase, I was working late one evening when a colleague sent me a message asking if I was planning to consolidate assets, attaching a link without explanation. I opened it casually, expecting nothing significant, and then felt my pulse shift as I saw photographs of my cabin listed on a real estate platform. The headline described it as a family trust asset pending consolidation, with language suggesting it was being repositioned under the Whitaker Family Trust for long-term estate alignment. My name was absent. The description implied that the property was part of a broader portfolio being restructured. For a few seconds, I stared at the screen, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew to be legally impossible. I pulled up the county records immediately, confirming that the deed remained unchanged and firmly under my name. The listing referenced internal trust documentation that did not exist. Someone had filed paperwork indicating the cabin was being absorbed into the Whitaker Family Trust, attaching what appeared to be amended trust language authorizing asset consolidation. The signatures displayed were not mine. The sensation was not shock so much as cold clarity. This was not a misunderstanding. It was forgery. The audacity of it was almost clinical. The move suggested confidence that either I would not notice quickly enough or that I would hesitate to challenge it publicly. I closed the listing and began making calls with the same measured focus I used during security breaches at work. The first call was to a forensic accountant I had consulted briefly during the estate transfer process, someone experienced in untangling layered financial structures and tracing irregular asset movement. I explained the situation without embellishment, forwarding the listing and associated documentation. The second call was to Margaret's attorney, who had handled the estate with meticulous attention and understood the clean separation between her assets and the original Whitaker Trust. The third call was to a corporate compliance contact at my mother's financial advisory firm, a connection I had maintained quietly over the years after noticing inconsistencies in how the trust was described. Within days, threads began to unravel. The paperwork filed regarding the cabin relied on amended trust documents that bore structural inconsistencies, language mismatches, and timing discrepancies that did not align with official filings. The forensic accountant identified signature irregularities and formatting deviations that suggested recent assembly rather than historical continuity. Margaret's attorney confirmed unequivocally that none of the inheritance assets had ever been directed into the Whitaker Family Trust and that there was no legal mechanism by which my cabin could be absorbed without my explicit, notarized consent. What emerged next was more disturbing than the attempted consolidation itself. As the forensic accountant dug into the history of the original family trust created after my father's death, transaction patterns surfaced that had never been transparently disclosed. Over the years, substantial withdrawals had been made under categories labeled discretionary family support and beneficiary advancement. On paper, the language appeared broad but permissible. In practice, the funds traced directly into expenditures that had little to do with shared family stability. There were payments covering cosmetic procedures billed under medical expense classifications. There were international travel packages categorized as restorative retreats. There was a significant transfer that aligned precisely with the down payment on Chloe's condo, structured through layered accounts to obscure the direct connection. Each expense had been authorized under trustee discretion, which my mother held exclusively, and documentation supporting the necessity or shared benefit of those expenditures was either minimal or non-existent. The pattern was consistent and prolonged. The trust that had been positioned as a symbol of security and legacy had been quietly drained to subsidize Chloe's lifestyle in ways that were never openly acknowledged. None of these disbursements had been clearly documented to reflect equal distribution or even formal beneficiary communication. I had been reminded repeatedly over the years that the trust required respect and alignment, that my access depended on loyalty, while simultaneously its assets were being redirected without transparency. Seeing the numbers laid out in forensic reports stripped away any remaining ambiguity. The original trust was not a safeguarded family foundation. It was a discretionary reservoir controlled unilaterally. Its funds diminished gradually under the guise of support, while I was told that questioning it would signal betrayal. The attempted absorption of my cabin into that same structure reframed the entire sequence of events. It was not merely about reclaiming control symbolically. It was about access to liquidity, about reestablishing a pipeline. The compliance contact at the advisory firm confirmed that the trust's historical reporting had contained irregularities that skirted formal audit triggers but would not withstand detailed scrutiny. There were no properly executed amendments authorizing the inclusion of independently inherited property. The forged documentation tied to my cabin appeared to be an effort to retroactively create that authority. Sitting in my office late at night, reviewing the compiled findings, I felt an absence of surprise that would have unsettled someone else. Instead, there was a steady internal recalibration. The voicemail at 2:17 a.m., the Thanksgiving comment, the rumors about Margaret's will, the quiet inquiries to her attorney, and now the forged trust consolidation all aligned along a single axis. Control had always been the currency. The trust was never simply an inheritance vehicle. It was leverage. The cabin in Pine Hollow had represented autonomy, a physical boundary set apart from inherited narratives. The attempt to reclassify it as a trust asset was not accidental or clerical. It was strategic positioning layered on top of years of undocumented withdrawals that had already hollowed out the original structure. The numbers did not lie. The signatures did not match. The documentation gaps were not clerical oversights. They were patterns. I closed my laptop that night with a clarity that felt heavier than anger. The sanctuary I had built was targeted not because of its market value, but because it existed outside the established hierarchy. And the financial records confirmed what had always lingered beneath the surface of family loyalty rhetoric. The foundation had been compromised long before the cabin listing appeared online. I did not call my mother after the forged listing surfaced, and I did not send a message demanding an explanation because I understood that confrontation without preparation would only trigger denial layered over narrative manipulation, and I had no intention of walking into that cycle again. Instead, I treated the situation the same way I handle a sophisticated breach in cybersecurity, assuming that emotion clouds judgment and that documentation is the only language that holds up under scrutiny. I began compiling everything methodically, building a structure of evidence piece by piece without signaling that I was doing so. The first step was preservation. I captured screenshots of the online listing in its entirety, including timestamps, metadata, and the phrasing that identified the cabin as a family trust asset pending consolidation. I archived the HTML source and stored multiple copies across encrypted drives, ensuring that even if the listing were removed or altered, I would retain proof of its existence in the form it originally appeared. I recorded the associated paperwork filed with the county, highlighting the discrepancies in signature structure and formatting inconsistencies that suggested recent fabrication rather than legitimate amendment. Next, I organized the financial audit trail the forensic accountant had begun mapping. Transaction histories were categorized chronologically, cross-referenced with external expenditures, and matched against Chloe's publicly visible lifestyle milestones. Cosmetic procedures labeled as medical necessities were paired with clinic invoices that did not align with insurance classifications. Travel expenditures categorized as restorative or educational were traced to luxury resort bookings and international itineraries that bore no connection to shared family benefit. The down payment on Chloe's condo was linked through layered transfers that attempted to obscure origin but ultimately converged with trust disbursement patterns. Each entry was cataloged without commentary, because interpretation would come later. Facts needed to stand alone. While compiling these records, I remembered a voicemail Margaret had left me months before her death, one I had not initially considered significant. At the time, she had sounded slightly unsettled but composed, mentioning that my mother had been asking strange questions about the will and about how flexible certain clauses might be if circumstances changed. Margaret had laughed softly in the message, brushing it off as curiosity, but there had been an undercurrent of awareness in her tone. I retrieved that voicemail from archive backups and had it transcribed and authenticated, preserving the original file to prevent claims of alteration. Hearing her voice again did not feel like comfort. It felt like corroboration. Once the evidence base was stable, I contacted an attorney in Grand Rapids named Samantha Reed, whose practice focused on fiduciary litigation and trust disputes. I chose her deliberately because she had no prior connection to my family, no history with my mother's advisory firm, and no reason to view the situation through the lens of local loyalty. During our first meeting, I laid out the timeline without embellishment, presenting the screenshots, the audit findings, the voicemail, and the sequence of filings that attempted to absorb my property into the Whitaker Family Trust. She did not react with outrage or disbelief. She reacted with precision, asking for specific dates, certified copies, and verification points. Within days, Samantha filed a temporary injunction to halt any action related to the sale or consolidation of the cabin, citing fraudulent documentation and irreparable harm. The injunction was not dramatic. It was procedural. It froze movement, forcing any further action to pass through formal review. Simultaneously, she prepared a motion to freeze the trust accounts identified as questionable, referencing the forensic findings that suggested mismanagement and undocumented beneficiary advances. The language was careful, structured to emphasize fiduciary duty rather than family conflict, because the issue at its core was not emotional. It was legal. In parallel, a formal complaint was submitted to my mother's financial advisory firm through appropriate compliance channels, outlining concerns about documentation irregularities and potential breaches of fiduciary responsibility. The complaint did not accuse. It requested internal review. It cited evidence. It asked for transparency. By routing the issue through corporate compliance rather than personal confrontation, the matter moved beyond private narrative control and into institutional oversight. Throughout this process, I maintained silence publicly. I did not alert extended family members, and I did not respond to subtle inquiries that continued to circulate. I did not attend gatherings or engage in defensive conversations. The strategy was not about winning an argument at a dinner table. It was about shifting the battleground entirely. Documentation replaced dialogue. Filings replaced phone calls. Certified mail replaced whispered insinuations. There was a strange calm in operating this way. For years, my responses to my mother had been reactive, shaped by guilt or by the desire to restore equilibrium. This time, there was no urgency to soothe. Every document was reviewed twice before submission. Every timeline was verified against independent records. Every statement was supported by attachment. I understood that once formal proceedings began, the story would no longer be controlled through tone or implication. It would be controlled through evidence. The injunction was granted swiftly, pausing any potential transfer of the cabin. Notices were served regarding the trust accounts, requiring disclosure of detailed transaction histories. The advisory firm acknowledged receipt of the compliance complaint and initiated an internal review process, as they were obligated to do when faced with potential fiduciary breaches. Each action moved quietly through official channels, generating paper trails that could not be erased by reframing the narrative at family gatherings. I did not feel triumphant. I felt steady. The shift from emotional leverage to documented accountability was not loud or theatrical. It was procedural, almost mundane, yet profoundly different from the patterns that had defined my relationship with my mother. She had relied on silence, implication, and reputation. I responded with records, timestamps, and filings. There were no raised voices, no confrontational messages demanding explanations. There was simply a case being built, step by deliberate step, For the first time, I was not trying to persuade her to see my perspective. I was establishing facts in environments where perspective carried less weight than proof. The forged listing, the undocumented withdrawals, the voicemail from Margaret, the trust disbursement patterns, each element was positioned within a structured argument that did not depend on family hierarchy. I did not yell because yelling would have returned the conflict to familiar ground. I documented because documentation shifts power into arenas where control is governed by verification rather than emotion. The first visible crack appeared faster than I expected, not because my mother's world was fragile, but because it had been held together by the assumption that no one would ever drag it into the light with paperwork attached. Once the injunction and motions were filed, everything started moving through channels she could not charm, intimidate, or reframe with a phone call, and within weeks the consequences began stacking in a way that made it impossible for her to keep the same polished posture in public. I received confirmation from Samantha that my mother had been placed on administrative leave at her firm while an internal audit was initiated. The phrase administrative leave sounded clinical, almost gentle, but I understood what it meant in practice. She was removed from active client access. Her accounts were reviewed. Her communications were logged. The firm had to protect itself, and when institutions feel threatened, they become ruthless in a way families rarely manage. The internal review did not stay internal for long. State regulators were notified, because once certain red flags are raised, firms cannot bury them without risking their own licenses. I watched the process unfold like a slow detonation, each step inevitable once the first report was submitted. Then the calls began, not to me directly at first, but through the web of people my mother had relied on for reputation. Clients who had once treated her like a trusted family advisor started questioning transactions described as personal loans taken from elderly accounts, withdrawals categorized as temporary transfers, movements that did not match the client's memories of consenting to them. The forensic accountant's findings were not isolated to the Whitaker family trust. Patterns extended outward, and once the firm began pulling threads, they found more than they expected. My mother had always been careful, but careful does not mean clean, and the audit worked through years of records with the kind of persistence she had never faced from anyone in our family. Chloe was the first one to break, not publicly, but in a way that felt like a private implosion. She reached out asking to meet, insisting it needed to be in person, and I agreed on a neutral location because I wanted to hear what she would say without giving her room to dramatize the setting. When she walked in, she looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, but emotionally, like someone who had been living in the confidence of protection and suddenly realized the protection was conditional. Her hand shook around her coffee cup, and the first thing she said was that she did not know everything. The words came out quickly, as if she needed to say them before her courage evaporated. She told me she had signed things our mother put in front of her, statements about caregiving for Margaret, letters implying involvement and authority, documents she had not read carefully because she trusted the person directing her. She insisted she had not understood the scope, that she thought it was paperwork to keep things organized, and while part of me wanted to dismiss that as convenient revision, I also recognized the way Chloe had been raised, protected from consequences and trained to follow my mother's instructions without question. Then she slid her phone across the table and showed me emails, chains of messages with my mother's language unmistakable, directing her to sign statements, to backdate documents to align with certain events, to use specific phrases to present herself as more involved than she was. The tone in the emails was not caring or maternal. It was managerial. Chloe was being used as a tool, and for the first time, she seemed to realize it. I forwarded the emails to Samantha immediately, preserving them with metadata intact, and Chloe watched me do it with a mixture of relief and terror. Relief because she was offloading a secret she could no longer carry. Terror because she finally understood that our mother's reach did not extend into legal consequences. Chloe kept saying she never meant for it to go this far, and I listened without offering comfort I did not feel. The damage had already been done. The only thing left was whether she would continue enabling it or finally step out of the structure she had benefited from. My mother did not contact me for a while after the filings, which was how I knew she was scrambling. Silence from her was never peace. It was recalculation. Then one night at the cabin, long after dark, I heard tires crunch on the gravel drive and a car door slam hard enough to echo through the trees. I stepped onto the porch and saw her standing at the edge of the yard in a coat that looked hastily thrown on, hair slightly disheveled. Face tight with rage, she was no longer bothering to package. The lake behind her was black, reflecting nothing, and the air had that sharp Michigan cold that makes every breath feel exposed. She walked toward me with the kind of furious momentum that used to make me flinch as a kid, and I watched myself remain still, noticing with a detached clarity that my body no longer reacted the way it once did. She did not bother with greetings. She said I was destroying this family, her voice shaking not with grief, but with panic, the panic of someone watching control slip through her hands. She listed the fallout like it was evidence of my cruelty, the audit, the regulators, the whispers, the humiliation. She framed it as betrayal, as if she were the injured party. I let her finish. I did not argue over details or defend my intentions. When she paused, waiting for me to crumble into apology the way I always had, I told her no. I stopped protecting her. The sentence came out calm, not rehearsed, not weaponized, just true. I saw something flicker behind her eyes, a moment of disbelief that I was not engaging in the old dance. She had expected a fight she could manipulate, not a boundary she could not penetrate. She stepped closer, lowering her voice into that familiar controlled tone, trying another angle, suggesting that families handle things privately, that mistakes happen, that she was under stress, that I had no idea what it was like to hold everything together alone. I listened and felt the emptiness of the script because I had heard variations of it for decades, each version designed to turn accountability into martyrdom. This time it did not land. The cabin was quiet except for the water moving faintly against the dock, and I realized that she looked less like a powerful matriarch and more like someone cornered by her own choices. After that night, events accelerated. My mother resigned from her position before she could be formally terminated, a strategic move meant to preserve a shred of dignity. But the resignation did not stop the process already in motion. Her license was suspended pending investigation and restitution, and the language in the notices was blunt in a way family conversation never had been. The Whitaker family trust, once treated like a sacred instrument of legacy, was dissolved under court supervision, with oversight imposed because the fiduciary mismanagement had become undeniable. The same trust that had been used to threaten and control was now a monitored liability, its remaining assets accounted for and distributed according to legal standards rather than my mother's preferences. As part of the proceedings, the attempted consolidation of my cabin was formally voided, and the property was permanently titled in my name without ambiguity, the court documents stating it plainly. Seeing that in writing felt less like victory and more like closure of a loop that had been open too long. The cabin remained what it had always been to me, a sanctuary, but now was also a line in the sand backed by law rather than hope. By the time the dust settled, my mother's empire, the image she had built in Brookhaven of strength and sacrifice and immaculate control, had collapsed into a paper trail of audits and suspensions and forced disclosures. The family narrative shifted overnight, and the same people who once accepted her version of events began speaking in cautious tones about how they had suspected things were off. Chloe stopped calling me for reassurance and started dealing with her own consequences, quieter now, stripped of the certainty that someone else would always absorb the impact. I did not feel like I had destroyed anything. I felt like I had finally stopped holding up a structure that was rotting from the inside, and once my hands let go, it fell under its own weight. When Christmas approached that year, I braced myself out of habit for the familiar tightening in my chest that used to come with the holidays, the anticipation of a late-night voicemail layered with accusation or a carefully worded message designed to reopen wounds that had barely begun to close. Instead, the days passed quietly. My phone remained still. There was no 2:17 a.m. vibration, no controlled voice reminding me of obligations or consequences. The silence felt different from the tactical pauses of the past. It felt empty of expectation. I chose to spend the holiday at the cabin in Pine Hollow, inviting a small group of friends who had stood beside me without asking for access to anything except honesty. There were people who knew the outline of what had happened, but never treated it like gossip or spectacle. They brought groceries, board games, extra blankets, and an ease that did not require performance. We cooked together in the small kitchen that once symbolized independence and now felt like solid ground. Snow settled along the dock and gathered on the railing in soft, undisturbed layers, and the lake reflected a pale winter sky that made everything look clean. There was laughter in the cabin that did not carry an undercurrent of evaluation. No one asked about trust structures or inheritance strategies. No one commented on whether my choices aligned with a family narrative. Conversations moved naturally from work frustrations to ridiculous memories from college to quiet moments where we simply sat and watched the fire settle into glowing embers. For the first time during a holiday, I was not scanning the room for tension cues or preparing to intercept a cutting remark disguised as humor. I was present in a way that felt unfamiliar. On Christmas morning, we exchanged small, thoughtful gifts that had nothing to do with status. One friend gave me a framed photo from a hiking trip we had taken months earlier, the lake behind us bright and uncomplicated. Another handed me a book she said reminded her of conversations we had late at night about resilience and choice. I realized that these gestures carried no expectation of repayment beyond appreciation. They were not investments. They were expressions. In the afternoon, when the cabin grew quiet and most of them stepped outside to walk along the frozen shoreline, I checked the mail slot out of habit and found a single envelope addressed in my mother's handwriting. The sight of it did not spike my pulse the way it once would have. It felt like an echo from a life I had already stepped out of. I carried it inside and opened it alone by the fireplace, the paper stiff and deliberate. The note was brief, written in the same controlled script I had seen on countless checks and formal documents. She wrote that she hoped one day I would understand why she did what she did. There was no apology in the sentence, no acknowledgement of harm, only the familiar framing that her actions, however exposed, were rooted in something larger that I simply failed to comprehend. I read it once and felt the old reflex to analyze, to search for subtext, to decode whether there was vulnerability hidden between the lines. Then I recognized the trap in that instinct. Understanding had always been the bait, the suggestion that if I just tried harder to see her perspective, I would find justification that made the pain coherent. I walked to the fireplace where the logs were already burning low and steady. The cabin was quiet except for the faint crackle of wood shifting in heat. I held the note for a moment, feeling the weight of years compressed into that single sentence, and then I let the paper fall into the flames. The edges curled quickly, ink darkening before disappearing entirely. I did not feel anger as it burned. I felt finality. Some things do not need to be dissected or empathized with endlessly. Some things require an ending, clean and irreversible. When my friends came back inside, cheeks red from the cold, they found me sitting on the floor near the fire, watching the last pieces of paper turn to ash. No one asked what I had burned. They did not need to. We resumed cooking dinner, moving around each other easily in the small space, music playing softly from a speaker on the counter. The evening unfolded without tension, without performance, without the subtle calculations that used to define every family gathering. Later that night, after everyone had gone to sleep and the cabin was wrapped in stillness, I stepped outside alone. Snow crunched under my boots as I walked toward the dock. The lake was frozen near the edges, the center dark and unmoving, reflecting the moon in a way that made the world feel suspended. I thought about being 12 years old, standing in the doorway of my mother's room, trying to be strong enough to carry her grief, absorbing responsibility because I believed that was the price of belonging. I thought about the years spent equating loyalty with silence, love with sacrifice, stability with self-erasure. Standing there in the cold, I realized that for the first time since that year, I was not bracing for impact. There was no looming threat of withdrawal or manipulation. No trust being dangled or revoked. No performance required to maintain access to approval. The systems that once defined my role had dissolved, not because I fought louder than she did, but because I stopped protecting the illusion that kept them intact. Peace did not arrive as a dramatic wave or an overwhelming rush. It settled gradually, like the snow on the dock, quiet and undemanding. It was the absence of constant vigilance. It was the understanding that I no longer needed to interpret every interaction through the lens of control. It was the simple fact that the cabin behind me was mine, not as a symbol of rebellion, but as a space free from leverage. I went back inside, locked the door, and let the fire burn low until only embers remained. For the first time in my adult life, the holidays did not feel like a test I had to pass or survive. It felt like time. And as I lay down that night, listening to the faint sound of wind moving through the pines, I felt something steady and unfamiliar settle into place. It was not triumph. It was not relief alone. It was peace, unaccompanied by conditions, and it did not require anyone else's permission to exist.